Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our national call. I expect a large group joining us today, so I'm going to give it at least a minute or two before we get started. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm going to give it about 30 seconds more and then we'll get started. Okay, hi, everybody. I'm Diane Yantel. I'm President and CEO of the National Income Housing Coalition. Thanks so much for joining today's National HoUSed campaign call for universal, stable, affordable homes. It's great to see people introducing themselves in the chat box. Please keep that up. We have a very important call today, as we've been anticipating for months, and after months of delays, the White House, congressional leaders, and key senators have restarted negotiations over what's likely to be a significantly scaled down reconciliation package. So you all know very well how we got here after Senator Joe Manchin effectively killed the House-passed almost $2 trillion Build Back Better Act last December. So since then, and really especially in recent weeks and recent days, congressional leaders have been working to find a compromise that can win the support of Senator Manchin and all of his Democratic colleagues. So at this point, the bill is really Senator Manchin's to write, and it's not entirely clear that he'll vote for it anyway. And it's also clear that this truly is our last chance to get the Build Back Better Act's transformative housing investments enacted in this year, or honestly, for years to come. It's also, to be honest, our toughest fight to keep these housing investments in a bill that moves forward. When Senator Manchin talks about the bill that he wants to write, it doesn't include housing investments. It includes deficit reduction, some lowering of health costs. It includes some climate initiatives, and really that's it. But he does also frequently mention the need for the bill to address inflation. And housing is the single largest component of key measures of inflation. And the White House is really making clear that they see key housing investments as important to lowering inflation. So that's our opening, to insist that Congress include significant investments to make housing affordable for people with the lowest incomes, and to help address inflation. So these next few weeks are really key. We can't let this once in a lifetime opportunity to advance these bold long-term solutions pass us by. So we're hosting a day of action tomorrow, and I encourage all of you to participate and encourage your networks, friends, neighbors to also participate. We're going to have a call-in day, a tweet storm at 1 p.m. Eastern time. the team has created plenty of tools for you to use to make sure that you can make the case for Congress to include in any reconciliation package robust affordable housing investments targeted towards those with the greatest needs, including our top priorities: $25 billion to expand rental assistance to more than 300,000 households, $65 billion to make critically needed repairs to public housing, $15 billion for the National Housing Trust Fund to build and preserve over 150,000 homes that are affordable to people with the lowest incomes. So I am really pleased on at such an important time and on such an important call to be able to welcome back to our national call Chair Maxine Waters. I just want to check and see if she is ready. It looks like she may not be quite ready yet. So while we wait, I'll actually ask for Sarah Sadian, who you all know well, our SVP for Public Policy and Field, to share some more details about the legislative outlook and the actions that we'd like everybody to take. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to hearing from the Congresswoman as well. I'll just fill in a little bit more details from what Diane provided. Here we are about 6 months after a stalemate after conservative Democrat Joe Manchin said that he wouldn't vote for the Build Back Better Act as it was currently written. We've been waiting for negotiations to restart, and it looks like we're finally coming to that moment now. We've been looking for signs of life, and it looks like this time there is some real optimism, especially among staff on the Hill, that this could result in a final agreement on a reconciliation package. The reports are noting that Senator Manchin and Schumer have been making progress in negotiating a deal. Some reports have said they are closer than they've ever been. Of course, they were very, very far apart before, so that might be a low bar, but progress is progress in seeing a deal move forward. The other thing that I've noticed that's different this time around is really that the White House has been much more vocal about the need for housing investments in a deal. Likely this is because the issue of inflation has been coming up over and over again, and because housing is a driver of inflation, and these housing investments are needed to directly address that. You may remember that the White House put out a housing supply plan recently and published an op-ed, both of which they used to call on Congress to pass the housing investments that were in Build Back Better. There's not a ton of details about where negotiations are. It does seem very likely that congressional leaders will use the framework that Senator Manchin offered that Diane referenced earlier. That would be to increase taxes on the high-income earners and corporations, to create some savings by allowing the federal government to negotiate drug prices, and then splitting that revenue in half between deficit reduction and direct spending, including on climate change and energy. We have heard that the deal could be about $1 trillion, maybe less. And of course, if half of those resources are going to deficit reduction, we're really talking about somewhere in the ballpark of $500 billion for direct spending. That's much, much smaller than the investments that we saw in the Build Back Better Act, which means it's going to be very difficult, but not impossible, for us to get housing investments in that bill. In terms of timing, the expectation is that Senator Manchin and Senator Schumer are going to have to reach a deal by July 4th if they want to be able to put that deal into legislative text and pass it through the cumbersome procedural process by the time that Congress leaves for August recess. We've also heard that if there really isn't a deal by the time they leave for August recess, the opportunity will have passed. And so we're really looking at just a small number of weeks where our advocacy is most needed and most important. I will say that part of the reason why it's so important for us to keep up our advocacy in this moment is because knowing that the overall package is so much smaller than before, congressional leaders are going to be looking for things to cut from a reconciliation package. And if they aren't hearing from housing advocates very loudly and consistently, it really gives them an excuse to be able to cut back housing investments, and we don't want to see that. We also know that our congressional champions, like Maxine Waters, who's with us today, and Senator Sherrod Brown, they are fighting for housing investments. And the more that other members of Congress are joining them in that fight and weighing in with leadership and weighing in with the White House, the more wind they have at their sails to be making, to be pushing for those resources and to try to make as strong of a play as possible. One of the best ways that folks can be engaged in this is to participate in our National Call-In Day and Twitter Storm tomorrow at 1 p.m. I'm going to encourage everybody to be calling their members of Congress and encouraging them to weigh in directly with leadership and with the White House. You might get a response back that probably is very familiar, that your members of Congress are supportive of housing investments, but at this moment, that's not enough. We really need them to be taking that additional action, to be weighing in with leadership, weighing in with the White House, and calling for those resources very specifically with them. You can use our call-in script to help you make those phone calls. You can also use our social media toolkit to tweet or use social media to raise up and lift up this issue with your members of Congress. You're going to want to remember to tag your member, thank them for their support, and encourage them to continue pushing as we go forward. I'm going to pause there and see if, actually, I won't pause there. I'm going to give a brief update on where things are also with appropriations, since that's also top of mind for many folks. Congress has come back into session after this past recess over Memorial Day. House and Senate Appropriations Committees are continuing to negotiate over top-line spending numbers for FY23. We know that there's a lot of optimism and hope that congressional leaders can reach a deal on a top-line spending amount for FY23 so that they can pass a bill before the end of the year. But it sounds like negotiations are really inching forward very slowly. It's unlikely that Congress is going to be able to pass a bill by the start of the fiscal year, which is October 1st. And so it is very likely that there is going to be at least one short-term continuing resolution that keeps the government funded and allows Congress a little bit more time to negotiate and to enact a final spending bill. The hope is that maybe they can pass something before the end of the year in November or December, rather than pushing it off into the new year when the new Congress comes into session. We know that even if they aren't able to reach an agreement on top-line spending numbers, we're going to see the House move forward with taking action. The House is going to very likely move forward with their draft spending bills using President Biden's budget request as a starting point. We have heard that the House Appropriations Committee is hoping to vote on in their subcommittees on the draft spending bill in mid-June, with a full committee vote at the end of the month. It's important to keep in mind that those numbers, because they're likely to be aligned with the president's budget, that's not an indication of where the final spending numbers will end up. We know that any appropriations bill has to also pass in the Senate, which means that there's going to be negotiations between Democrats and Republicans on top-line spending numbers. So we might see this House bill be more like a top watermark of what's possible in an FY23 spending bill, and maybe a final bill that's a little bit lower or closer to whatever the Senate numbers are whatever the Senate is able to put out. We are still circulating our national letter in support of the highest level of funding possible for housing programs in FY23. I encourage you to sign on to it and share it with your partners. I believe there's over 1,600 organizations that have already signed on. This is a really important way for us to show these members of Congress, as they're negotiating a spending bill, to make sure that housing resources are getting the most amount of funding that's possible. And I also want to just remind folks to continue to push for some of our top priorities this year. What we would really like to see is enough funding not only to renew all existing housing choice vouchers, but to expand rental assistance to another 200,000 households. That's the amount that was proposed by the president in his budget request. And if it were enacted, it would be the largest one-time increase in the program in its history. So it would help put us on a path towards universal housing assistance. So it's really important that we're continuing to weigh in with members of Congress about why those resources are so important. In addition to that, we are continuing to push for robust funding for public housing to continue operating it and preserving it through the capital fund. We'd like to see $3.6 billion for homeless assistance grants to help address the needs of people who are experiencing homelessness, $100 million for legal assistance to help prevent evictions, and $300 million for competitive tribal funds targeted to those with the greatest needs. I'm going to stop there as I see that the Congresswoman has joined us. Diane.
Perfect timing, Sarah. Thank you. And it is my pleasure to welcome back to our national call Chairwoman Waters, especially given the importance of this moment with negotiations around a possible reconciliation bill happening again. You know, you all on this call know as well as I do that there is no greater champion in Congress for transformative housing investments targeted towards those with the greatest needs. Chairwoman Maxine Waters has spent her life and her career prioritizing housing solutions for those experiencing homelessness and for renters with the lowest incomes. And certainly the last several years were no exception. As chair of the powerful House Financial Services Committee, Maxine Waters led efforts in Congress to enact nearly $100 billion in resources for renters and people experiencing homelessness, including emergency rental assistance, emergency housing vouchers, and other resources. And it was really through her leadership that the House included and enacted, passed more than $150 billion in housing investments in the Build Back Better Act. And she is continuing to fight for these resources in any bill that moves forward. So Chairwoman Waters, it's so good to see you. Thank you for joining us. Welcome back. And I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so very, very much. Let me just say good afternoon. And I thank you so much for having me here today. Before I begin, I would like to thank Diane Yantel for the kind introduction. And I'm so pleased to join you all again for this call to revive our discussions on the importance of fair and affordable housing investments in any reconciliation package. Last year, I wrote the housing title to the Build Back Better package that provided long overdue investments in housing and urged Congress to pass it into law immediately. The $150 billion in the housing title passed the House last November, but signing the package into law remains more critical now than ever to create, preserve, or retrofit more than 1 million affordable homes. Since the last time I joined you, a lot has happened. Housing and rent prices have continued to skyrocket, contributing to the inflation that is affecting families and the economy. Eviction filings are rising in many communities. Housing discrimination continues to affect the ability of people of color and other protected classes to secure housing and may remain stably housed. States and localities have exhausted pandemic relief, including the emergency rental assistance funding that my committee provided and that you helped us secure through various relief packages, including the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan. For decades, our country has faced an affordable housing crisis that has harmed countless families and our economy as a whole. It is unacceptable that today, over 20 million renters have to pay more than half their income on rent. 580,000 people are experiencing homelessness on any given night, and millions are locked out of home ownership, including more than 20 million millennials. We must continue to push for the long overdue resources for fair and affordable housing that were included in Build Back Better and are central to economic growth and financial stability. As conversations continue around a slimmed down reconciliation package, we must ensure that housing remains a top priority. As my committee has shown, housing is the foundation of opportunity and affects nearly every aspect of our lives. Housing is racial justice, it's healthcare, it's child stability, and it's environmental justice. Without a fair, affordable, and adequate housing market, we cannot address inflation. Our economy will suffer and families will suffer. In fact, As we commemorate June National Homeownership Month, we must ensure we have a housing system and pipelines of homes that serve families at every stage of life. People should not be forced into homelessness or forced into housing instability that prevents them from saving for future life opportunities like homeownership. Our current housing system is failing nearly every family in our country, but that is especially true for the lowest income families and for many communities of color. It's this failing system that is leaving too many people with so few options and contributes to the unacceptable levels of homelessness in America, a weakening middle class, and the growing racial wealth gap. So I will continue to fight to ensure that robust investments for fair and affordable housing are included in any reconciliation package that moves in the Senate, and I hope you will too. And I thank NLIHC and its members for your continued support and advocacy to ensure we overcome this national housing crisis and that every family has an affordable place to call home. I want you to know that I decided to call Manchin and try to arrange an appointment. His response was not that encouraging. He said he'd be willing to meet with me, but he's not willing to do what I want him to do, which is basically include housing, preferably at 150 billion, but he's not willing to include any housing at this point. And so I think despite all of the work that we're doing, all of the advocacy, that we have to be creative and we have to think about targeting and looking closely at how we can be in contact with the people in his district that need this housing. As I look at his district, well, the state rather, not his district, but the state, parts of it in West Virginia, I'm finding that there are poor people. There are people who need housing. And I'm just wondering what else we can do to try and connect with them. And of course, my first thought is to go up there with a group of people and start to campaign door to door. I know that sounds like unreal now, but I'm getting desperate that Manchin, and I don't know if he's joined by Cinema, they seem to work so closely together that they're going to X out all housing. So continue the emails, everything you can do on all of the social media platforms. Continue to try and impress on Republicans that they have poor people and people who need affordable housing in their state and in their districts. Again, you've been doing such a wonderful job in advocating for housing, and I appreciate you so much. And I thank you for coming today with this meeting that we're having to continue to put a focus on the need for housing. Let's keep going in every conceivable way. And if Manchin will meet, despite the fact he said he won't change his mind, I'll meet with him anyway and try. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Chairwoman Waters. We appreciate, as always, your tenacity and your leadership and your unwillingness to give up and take no for an answer. We're certainly not going to take no for an answer either. As far as we're concerned, this bill is not done until it's done, and we are going to keep making the case and keep pushing for the robust housing resources that you ensured were included and passed through the House. We do have some very good partners in West Virginia who I know would be delighted to welcome you to West Virginia if you decide to go. We'd be really happy to make that connection. And so knowing that it's not over till it's over, despite the disappointing news from Senator Manchin himself, and knowing how short the time frame is for any kind of a deal to come together, in addition to everything that we'll do with our partners in West Virginia to try to get Senator Manchin on board, what else would you say is, the top one or two things that advocates across the country should focus on to shore up your efforts to get housing in this final bill?
Well, I hear a lot, of course, the comments and the conversation about housing is very, very focused on trying to, identify and define the need. So we have a lot of discussion going on about it. And I'm very appreciative for that. But they kind of lump us all into one category and say that the Congress of the United States has got to do something about homelessness, got to do something about housing. And they don't seem to understand that Democrats are, online and basically advocating and working toward that. And I'm trying to think of some ways that in our approach that we can absolutely let them know who they must target when people are talking to us about how bad it is. Let them know how outraged we are about homelessness. And please let them know that, as you have said, despite perhaps not a real understanding of how things work in Congress, let them know that I and my committee are absolutely committed. And look how well we've done as we have put in money for homelessness, as we have, put together Build Back Better. Point out to them that there are people that are hardworking on all of these issues. And I think that we've got to be a little bit more definitive about who's holding it up and who's, not really supporting not only Build Back Better, but the whole idea that if we have the will to do so, we can get rid of homelessness. Let them know that I am fighting and leading and that been doing this and I'm committed to it and will make myself available any place, anytime, anywhere to continue the conversation.
We absolutely will. And I know everybody on this call has no question about your leadership and your effectiveness in getting housing resources to your district and to others across the country. Another piece of the negotiations that seems helpful is that the White House has recently been amplifying the need for housing investments and other actions to resolve the housing crisis. They put out their housing supply plan. They've talked about housing as one of the largest contributors to inflation. So have you had any discussions with the White House, anything you can share about either from the leadership or from the White House about what may happen next with this reconciliation package?
Well, not a lot, but I have threatened to pull out Build Back Better and put it into a single piece of legislation if we continue to get the word that it's not going to be in Build Back Better. And of course, the leadership does not want us to do that. They want us to give them continued opportunities to negotiate. But the conversation that I had was, if I'm getting a no, if I'm not getting any encouragement in these negotiations, I'm going to peel back our housing and Build Back Better and go for a single piece and make it the focus and the primary focus of our work, and get my colleagues to join us in saying that this is what we're focused on. And of course, that was not met with a lot of support, but I'm doing everything that I can to let people know how serious I am.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you have a chance, you'll see in the chat box that many people are thanking you for your efforts and stating how strongly we are behind you and recognizing your leadership with gratitude. One last question, if you have time for it, Chairwoman Waters, that whether or not the Build Back Better housing investments are enacted this year, we know that it's not all that's needed to end homelessness and end housing poverty in this country. So can you talk a little bit about, outside of Build Back Better or reconciliation, what are your other top priorities for this year and for the next Congress?
Oh, well, let me just say housing is certainly the top priority. You have over and over again identified the need for affordable housing and to deal with homelessness. Here in Los Angeles, as you know, I was about to call for the resignation of LASA executive, but she decided herself she was leaving, that she was going to resign because of the complication of the process. And one of the things that I want to do is I want to work closely with the county and the city of Los Angeles, for example, to look at how we can streamline these processes. The other thing that I'm looking at, I'm continuing to try and do an assessment of how many affordable units have been built since the two items had on the ballot, where the city and the county of Los Angeles, for example, did raise money for affordable housing and for affordable housing with the ability for the people to have assistance in all of their medical needs and other kinds of things. So that's just Los Angeles. And I think we need to know better what is going on in each state. For example, the state of California has a huge budget. And their budget access is something that the governor, can choose to prioritize in any way that he'd like to do. And I know he's good. He's good about prioritizing and looking at different aspects of the need in our society in California. But I need to talk to him and see if with this budget excess that they have, is there some more money in there for housing? And in addition to that, looking at all of the states. In addition to that, of course, we've got to take a look at the big banks again. And we're trying to organize a hearing that we wanted to have before we go on recess. I don't know if we're going to get it in July, but if we don't, it may not be until September, but we're going to have all the banks back in again. We're going to have them back in because, without people really knowing or understanding, predatory lending in some shape and form is still going on. And many of our homeowners who are fighting to hold on to their homes are finding themselves very stressed out because they're not getting the loan modifications that they thought they would be able to get, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to bring the banks in and we're going to push very, very hard about what they're doing and point out what they're not doing and see if we can get more help for our homeowners. We've got to get more money for rental assistance. We cannot think that because we had 46.6 that our job was done, it's over. And so we've got to go for more money for housing assistance. It's critical that we get housing assistance. To the degree that we don't get it, we have more homelessness. We have more people in tents. We have more people on the street. So in terms of housing and my committee, we're looking at that. We're looking at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that we're going to strengthen. It was undermined by Trump and Mulvaney and those who hate the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau so much that they did everything to destroy it. So we'll be taking a close look and actively working on ways by which we basically strengthen the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and do some of the corrections that need to be done that were basically caused by the Trump administration. We're also, of course, forced to look at cryptocurrency and what the feds are doing, what the Treasury is doing, what SEC is doing. We have some presidential papers about urging people to work together, but we know that some of our younger people who are getting absolutely misled by the fact that, you have all of these ads that are going out talking about how much money you can make investing in cryptocurrency. And of course, we have seen in recent months that a lot of people lost millions of dollars because they took that chance. We've got to put consumer protection into cryptocurrency. We've got to make sure that we do everything that we can to develop public policy that will protect people from investing and being told that they are somehow taken care of, that they won't lose because will have their investments protected, et cetera, et cetera. So those are some of the things, of course, that we're working on, and much more. But these are some of the things that are top of mind and top of my agenda.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us, Chairwoman Waters. It's helpful to know what's ahead. And again, many thanks for joining us today, but even more importantly, for your leadership and your tenacity. Please keep fighting for these housing dollars in a reconciliation package. We are behind you all the way. And if there's anything more we can do to help your efforts be successful, we'll be there. Just let us know. So thank you so much, Chairwoman Waters.
Thank you so much. And I will be calling you back. I have something that I need to share and talk with you about, but I will call you back. Thank you.
Okay, good. I look forward to it. Thank you. Okay, wonderful as always to have Chairwoman Waters on with us. We certainly have our work cut out for us in these next few weeks and months, as I think she made very clear. So we will reiterate again at the end of the call all the actions that we hope you will take with us tomorrow and in the days and weeks to come to make our biggest push and our best effort to include these housing investments in a reconciliation bill. As you can hear, it's a steep uphill climb, and we really need to do all we can to keep those funds in. So I'm going to turn now to our next two speakers, Sandra Park, who is a senior attorney with the Women's Rights Project at ACLU, and Maria Romyanceva. I know I got that wrong. Maria, you'll correct me. She's the associate coordinator with the National Coalition for Civil Rights to Counsel, and they are here to talk about Right to Counsel's impact on preventing evictions. And just so everybody remembers, in the HoUSed campaign's top priorities includes a whole set of robust and permanent tenant protections, including right to counsel. So I'm really glad to welcome you both to the call, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Diane. I'll start off and then hand it over to Maria. We really appreciate you all having us today to discuss our research brief that we published a few weeks ago, the ACLU and the National Coalition for Civil Right to Counsel. It's called No Eviction Without Representation. The title is inspired by Right to Counsel campaigns led by tenant organizers. Next slide, please. So I work at the ACLU Women's Rights Project, and one of our priorities is challenging the particular barriers to fair housing faced by low-income Black women and other women of color. And our work is really rooted in understanding that one's home is central to all of life's opportunities. Next slide, please. At the ACLU, our engagement with this issue actually goes back 35 years. The ACLU's first report was published in 1987 called Justice Evicted, and it documented many of the due process problems and inequalities in eviction cases that sadly still hold true today. Next slide, please. At the Women's Rights Project, we prioritize this issue because we understand the gendered and racial impact of evictions. For example, back in 2020, we released an analysis based on data from Eviction Lab that showed that Black women renters had evictions filed against them at double the rate of white renters or higher in 17 of 36 states. Next slide. While the disparities in representation of landlords compared to tenants in eviction cases remain high, there's been significant and really exciting progress on right to counsel in the last few years. Thanks to much tenant organizing and many other people's efforts, 3 states and 15 cities have now enacted right to counsel, and NCCRC and the ACLU have been supporting those efforts in both in the past as well as on an ongoing basis. Next slide, please. So in terms of the research brief, we wanted to really collect the relevant empirical research to help educate policymakers and stakeholders about the issue. This was a collaboration with Maria and others at the coalition, as well as many within the ACLU, including our research department. Next slide. We basically looked at studies that really covered the harms of eviction, as well as the benefits of representation in eviction cases. And again, we were aimed at educating advocates as well as policymakers about the issue. Next slide. In terms of methodology, I won't go into that in detail, but just wanted to note that we reviewed and included 49 sources. Next slide. On to key findings. So the first part of the report, which goes into all of this in more depth, we reviewed numerous studies on the harms of eviction. Next slide. Including how they contribute to the cycle of poverty, how they impact children, the health impact on civil engagement and voting, and the disproportionate impact and harms on Black and Latinx women and children. I'm going to turn it over to Maria now.
Thanks, Sandra. So the next part of the report really focuses on the right to counsel for tenants facing eviction. And when we talk about the right to counsel, we're talking about a specific policy that we define in the report as a guarantee from the government that's established in the law that all tenants or a defined subset of tenants, group of tenants, must be provided with legal representation in eviction proceedings. And this report looks both at evaluations of existing right to counsel programs. Those evaluations are limited because the growth in the right to counsel for tenants facing eviction really took off in 2017 when New York City became the first city to pass a right to counsel for tenants. And so since then, there are now 18 jurisdictions with such a right, but only a few of those have been implemented to the degree where they could have been evaluated. So the two programs that we've evaluated in the report are Cleveland and New York City. But the other research that was reviewed, analyzed, assessed for this report included data from pilot projects and data from representation studies, so studies that looked at increasing representation for tenants facing eviction. And so across the board, what we found is that rates of eviction were significantly lower for represented tenants compared to unrepresented tenants, and that providing representation is a cost-effective measure for jurisdictions. And so 7 studies and reports about tenant representation are surveyed in this brief. I've highlighted 4 of those, and I'm not going to go into detail about what those projects look like, but consistently what you can see in the data that's available, the empirical evidence that's available, is that out of California, for example, under the Sargent-Shriver Act of 2009, an analysis of the housing pilot projects that were developed under that Act found that in providing various legal services to tenants, including full representation, so program clients were 3 times less likely to default, nearly half as likely to have to pay damages or attorney's fees than pro se tenants, and 71% of Shriver clients had obtained a new rental unit 1 year after being served, compared to 43% of non-Shriver tenants. Hennepin County, Minnesota has been doing a housing court project for a significant amount of time, and a study there just found that fully represented tenants won or settled their cases 96% of the time. Nearly 80% were able to leave court without an eviction record. Nearly twice as many represented compared to unrepresented tenants were likely to retain possession of their homes. For New York City and Cleveland, again, those are programs that have right to counsel in place. Evaluations of those programs also consistently find success. So there have been 4 evaluations done of New York City's right to counsel program, which is called the Universal Access to Counsel program. There have been 4 evaluations conducted by the Office of Civil Justice there. And the latest evaluation found that 84% of fully represented tenants remained in their homes. The rate of representation has steadily increased throughout the right to counsel program as it's existed, and more tenants are avoiding default and responding to their eviction proceedings. In Cleveland, the most recent evaluation came out in 2022. It was done by Stout Risius Ross LLC. It's a recent independent evaluation of the program, the Right to Counsel program that exists in Cleveland. And there they found that 93% of clients served by the program were able to avoid an eviction judgment or an involuntary move. 83% of clients participating in the program were able to secure rental assistance. And this is really critical, this finding, because of the 21% of clients who weren't even aware of the possibility of rental assistance when they contacted legal aid, approximately 98% wanted rental assistance, and legal aid was able to assist 81% of those clients obtain it. The other major finding out of the Cleveland evaluation is that ultimately the report found that the preliminary fiscal impact of having a right to counsel in Cleveland and Cuyahoga County more broadly for 2021 was a savings of approximately $4.3 to $4.7 million for Cleveland and the county. Next slide, please. So getting to the conclusions and recommendations of the report, and then we'll wrap it up for questions and answers. Next slide. Thank you. So what the major kind of conclusions that we pull from the research that's highlighted in this report is that there are well-known, documented, and extensive harms of eviction, and they're disproportionately harming communities of color, and particularly Black and Latinx women and children. The survey of all of the available research that we highlight in the report shows that tenants who have legal representation just fare better in eviction proceedings than those who do not. So they're more likely to remain housed, they're less likely to receive an eviction judgment, and they're less likely to suffer the collateral consequences of having an eviction record. Increasing tenant legal representation and providing a right to counsel is a demonstrably effective and cost-effective intervention in the eviction crisis. It is not the only intervention that needs to be put in place to address the housing crisis that we're all experiencing and working through right now. But it is a critical, vital intervention that can start to balance that stark disparity in representation between landlords and tenants. There are now 18 jurisdictions that provide a right to counsel for tenants, but when you review nationwide, on average, only 3% of tenants are represented compared to 81% of landlords. Next slide. So for our recommendations, and they're listed on the last couple of pages of the report, and you'll find that they're really detailed, but they really touch on recommendations to the federal, state, and local levels, mainly for the federal government to fully fund efforts to establish and implement right to counsel programs at the state and local level. We focus on it that way because state and local jurisdictions and advocates in those jurisdictions are just better equipped to assess and identify the needs of their tenants and what the right to counsel should look like in their jurisdiction. And also that the federal government should increase awareness among localities and states about the portions of ERAP funding and FRF funding and dollars that are available to support legal services, increasing legal services for tenants facing eviction. The NCCRC, so if you go to our website, civilrighttocounsel.org, you'll find that we track those jurisdictions and legal services providers that have been able to tap those funds in order to either increase representation or to stand up a right to counsel program in some situations. For local and state governments, our main recommendations, and these are really fully detailed thoroughly in the report, is to enact and implement a right to counsel in their jurisdictions. And we lay out some of the kind of outline what that right to counsel should really assess and include, which includes, extending it to all eviction proceedings and administrative proceedings that are the equivalent of an eviction, extending the right to counsel to all tenants, regardless of income, which some jurisdictions like San Francisco have done, and fund really community organizers in order to increase awareness and really fully, appropriately and adequately implement the right to counsel in these jurisdictions. The other piece that I wanted to highlight for recommendations is that local and state governments really need to support research and evaluation that assesses the outcomes and identifies the best practices for right to counsel programs. And that's just because right to counsel is a really thriving movement for tenants right now, really led by tenants and tenant organizers, but it's just in its kind of beginning stages. And there are a lot of issues with implementation that we want to make sure we're addressing, assessing, and kind of supporting, seeing that the right to counsel, the impact that the right to counsel really has for tenants and jurisdictions. And I think if we go to the last slide, I think we are, yes, we are done. That was a very quick overview of a very, a report that took a very long time to, to write.
Well, I want to thank you so much for sharing that. I am not Diane Yantel. You might be surprised to see my face. I'm stepping in for her for a second because the Congresswoman followed up from our presentation here and gave her a call. So I'd love to just take a second to see any questions that might be coming in the Q&A box. So just a reminder to folks to enter your questions there. And I'll take a look to see that those questions that might be coming in with the chat box. I see a lot of questions about or a lot of notes of appreciation for the work that you've been doing here. Somebody has asked about your position or your thoughts about supporting and funding nonprofit organizations that could also be serving tenants and provide tenant educational outreach services and support. Is that something that you address in the report?
Yeah, it's part of the recommendations where we lay out for local and state governments, where we make the recommendation to implement, to pass, enact, and implement a right to counsel. That's one of the pieces that's really, really critical as we're finding right to counsel programs kind of expand and be implemented, is that you just need that community organizer support. You need to fund other organizations that work with tenants more holistically and to kind of ensure that they're aware of the right to counsel in their jurisdiction as it's developing, but also to be supported in the variety of other ways that they need to be supported. Right to counsel is not the answer for everything, but it's a really vital intervention when people are facing this really kind of desperate, critical crisis in their lives.
Yeah, thank you for that so much. I don't happen to see other questions that are coming in the chat box or in the Q&A box, but I encourage you, if you're able to stay on and see if other folks are asking questions and respond directly. I know that your time is limited, but if you're able to do that, that would be wonderful. And I just want to thank you again for joining us with us and for rolling with a little change in the schedule. I know that we were expecting to speak a little earlier on the call, so appreciate that. And now we can go on to our next speaker, which is our own Sophie Sibak Glover from the National Open Housing Coalition, who can give us an update on the RACE project. I'll turn it over to you, Sophie.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everybody. My name is Sophie Sibak Glover, and I will be talking about a few of the major findings in NLHC's new report, Balancing Act. Next slide. This is a quick overview of what's covered in the brief. Next slide. But before I jump into the major findings, I want to quickly remind us of some of the major time points in ERA reallocation. In September of 2021, the ERA1 reallocation process began, and since then, 3 rounds of ERA1 reallocation have occurred. In March 2022, ERA2 reallocation began. At the end of June, we anticipate the second round of ERA2 reallocation to occur. Next slide. There are a few major deadlines approaching in 2022. September marks the deadline for grantees to obligate ERA1 funds, with grantees who received reallocated ERA1 funds being allowed an extension until December. ERA2 funds must be obligated by September 2025. Next slide. Our first major finding is that nearly 50% of state grantees are projected to exhaust their ERA1 and ERA2 funds by the end of the year. To determine when grantees may exhaust their ERA1 and ERA2 funds, NLIHC evaluated spending trends between January 2021 and March 2022. As you can see, the number of state grantees projected to exhaust their ERA1 and ERA2 funds will steadily increase throughout the second half of 2022. And by December, we project that 23 state grantees and the District of Columbia are projected to exhaust their ERA1 and ERA2 funds. Even if a grantee's funds are not exhausted, some programs have chosen to close their application portals, having obligated a significant share of their funds. And so eligible households may be without assistance even earlier than NLIHC predicts ERA funds will be exhausted. Next slide. Our second major finding is that the statutory requirement to base states' allocation on population rather than need created disparities between states' ability to potentially serve the number of cost-burdened low-income renters in the state. And I encourage those interested to take a look at the brief to learn more about this disparity. Next slide. While cost-burdened low-income renter data can be used to generate an estimate of households that may have needed housing assistance during the pandemic and could be eligible for emergency rental assistance, we know that millions of renter households lost employment income and fell behind on their rent during the pandemic. The US Census Bureau's Household Pulse Survey provides a more time-sensitive estimate of renter households who are behind on paying their rent. Comparing this data to the amount of ERA funds grantees had remaining at the end of March 2022, NLIHC finds significant disparities in grantees' resources and abilities to satisfy the outstanding need in their states. The states with the lowest remaining ERA funds per renter household behind on rent are New York, California, Texas, North Carolina, and New Jersey. Given the average amount of ERA assistance dispersed per household, none of these 5 states would be able to serve all renter households estimated to be behind on rent with its remaining funds. On the other end of the spectrum, the states with the most remaining ERA funds per household behind on rent have between 19,000, such as in Wyoming, and 40,000 in Vermont. Next slide. To an extent, Treasury can address disparities created by the initial allocation formula and better balance grantees' remaining funds with outstanding needs through the reallocation of ERA1 and ERA2 funds. NLHC estimates that between $4.1 billion and $5.1 billion of ERA1 and ERA2 could be reallocated based on current guidance and available data. Although it's important to note that it's difficult to estimate precisely how much could be reallocated, and this estimate could be less or more depending on how quickly grantees obligate ERA funds. These estimates indicate that the current reallocation process will not be able to fully address the disparities between grantees' remaining funds and need among renters. For example, California, Illinois, New Jersey, New York, and Texas would need more than $1 billion each to serve the estimated number of renter households behind on rent, given the average ERA assistance distributed per household served. Even though reallocation cannot entirely address the disparity, data from the first and second round of ERA1 reallocation indicate that it did help correct the disproportionate amount of funding to state grantees that state grantees received compared to local grantees. Next slide. Based on this analysis, NLHC provided recommendations for ERA grantees, Treasury, and Congress. It's shaded, but you can see that ERA grantees running low on funds may be able to use other federal funds to help meet their need, like CDBG-CV and state and local fiscal relief funds. NLHC recently released a report about leveraging other federal funds to extend ERA programs, which is linked in the slide and I can post in the chat. Treasury is statutorily constrained in addressing the disparity in the initial ERA allocation through the reallocation process. Given the constraints faced by Treasury, difficult decisions regarding the recipients of reallocated funds will need to be made. Treasury should prioritize grantees in jurisdictions with large numbers of unserved, cost-burdened, low-income renter households. Second, As their funds run out, many grantees are beginning to consider next steps for their emergency rental assistance programs. Because the reallocation process occurs on a rolling basis, these grantees are unsure of the scale of additional funds, if any, that they could receive in the future. So we recommend that Treasury should increase the transparency of its reallocation determination process. Third, while NLHC consistently advocates for increased federal investment to expand and preserve the supply of affordable and available rental homes to the lowest income households, ERA 2 is not the appropriate source for funds for this activity, particularly given the ongoing need. Therefore, we recommend that Treasury should issue guidance on other affordable housing purposes that make clear that the priority for ERA 2 funding is rental assistance. Next slide. And next slide. Thank you. To address a housing crisis that pre-existed the pandemic, was exacerbated by its disruptions, and will continue to persist after COVID-19 subsides, Congress must enact permanent housing solutions and provide further support to the Housing Choice Voucher Program, public housing, and the National Housing Trust Fund. Congress should also authorize and fund a permanent program to support households that experience financial shocks, such as the program envisioned in the Eviction Crisis Act. Next slide. I went over those findings extremely quickly, so for those interested, I will drop a link to the brief in the chat. And for those who have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me at my email address. Lastly, I just want to point out that spending is only one angle to evaluate emergency rental assistance programs. And so I strongly recommend folks visit NLIHC's resource hub for additional research on ERA implementation. I'll turn it back to you, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sophie. I always love hearing your updates about the program. I feel like I learned so much, even though I'm also really in the weeds on the ERA program. So thank you for that perspective. I don't happen to see any questions in the chat box now, but like others, I encourage you to stay online so that you can answer people's questions if they have them. And remember, to everyone who's on today's call, you can reach out to Sophie and she's happy to help you answer any questions that you might have. Thanks. And we'll go on to our next speaker. Erin Kemple is coming from Connecticut to speak to us about their work around the RACE program. Erin, are you with us? Maybe we are running into an issue here. Is Erin with us today? And if not, I guess we'll move on to our next speaker, and hopefully Erin will be able to join back with us. I'm going to turn it over now to Shakti Robbins Kubus from the New York Housing Conference to give an update from the field. Shakti, are you here? Hey, Shakti.
Yep. So thanks so much for having me on to talk about our New York City Housing Tracker. My name is Shakti Robbins Kubus. I'm a policy analyst with New York Housing Conference. We're a statewide nonprofit affordable housing and advocacy organization. We work in broad-based coalitions to support city, state, and federal affordable housing policy. And just a little bit of context, New York City just selected a new mayor, and much of the city council is new, as well as our borough presidents, who play a major role in land use decisions as well. And so we issued recommendations as a coalition last year around a new housing plan. We were calling for $4 billion in capital per year. We wanted to see a focus on need instead of the number of units, of course, because the need is disproportionately among low-income households. And we also wanted to see a more equitable plan that required all neighborhoods to participate in addressing the housing crisis. So we developed a New York City Affordable Housing Tracker, and it shows the affordable housing production in each city council district under the previous mayor over the 8 years of his housing plan. And, we hope this is going to be helpful in educating some of the newer elected officials, help inform the development of a new housing plan, and serve as an advocacy tool for organizations and individuals that want to see more affordable housing built in their neighborhoods. And we released a report as well, and I will put everything in the chat really quickly. And the report just details, it's an analysis of the data, and it details some of the policy decisions that contributed to where we build and don't build in New York City. So we worked with some of the council members to announce it. We held a press conference with the chairs of housing, both the chairs of housing and land use committees. And we're really excited that they're on board and supportive. And we got a good amount of press around it, both digital and TV and media. So the New York City metro area has been lagging in housing production for a long time. We also, of course, see that it disproportionately impacts low-income households. We have a shortage of over 770,000 units for very low and extremely low-income households. Thank you, NLIC, of course, for that data. And we've also seen rents increase dramatically since pre-COVID and really surpassing pre-COVID rents. And you can see from this map, if you're familiar with New York City at all, you can see that the higher production areas are really concentrated in places like the Bronx and central Brooklyn. And just to go into a little bit more detail, the last housing plan produced over 67,000 new affordable units over 8 years. And you can see the wide disparity in production, where the 10 districts that were the highest producers produced over 38,000, and the lowest producers only produced 740 units over 8 years. And some of the characteristics that we found of a higher affordable housing producing district is already high density. They have lower land costs and often underutilized and city-owned land. We also saw these neighborhoods could also be high density, fast growing neighborhoods that use tax incentives and participated in the mandatory inclusionary housing program. And with a couple of exceptions, these were predominantly Black and Latinx neighborhoods with lower median incomes. And lower affordable housing districts often had lower density with strict limits on what could be built. So we saw that several of them, of course, were zoned for single family, and several had also actually been downzoned, not under the previous mayor, Mayor de Blasio, but actually under Mayor Bloomberg. So very early in the 2000s, some of these districts were downzoned. They had fewer vacant and industrial or manufacturing zone land, and of course, little publicly owned land. There were limited HPD programs, which is our housing agency, to build smaller buildings in less dense neighborhoods, and there was a greater share of white residents and higher median incomes. So when you visit the website, you can scroll through and see each district has some basic information about housing need. We also include public housing, capital needs as well. And then when you click on an individual district, you'll get some more details. And that includes some demographic information, also households entering the city shelter system, and details on the existing housing stock. And we also break down the AMI of the affordable housing that was constructed under the plan.
That's really fascinating information. I'm wondering what has been the response so far from people who've been seeing this tracker and digging into it?
We've had mostly a positive response, certainly from some of the members who ran on increasing affordable housing. They're almost fighting over like who had the most production, even though a lot of them weren't yet in office, since it was over 8 years and they're term limited. And you know, we had a lot of interest from the press. And I mean, the mayor also identified when he was running for office that he wanted to really focus on a more equitable plan. So we hope he's going to be really open to looking at it and making sure every neighborhood participates in the plan as they're releasing something new, which should be any day now.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's a great tool for giving credit to those council members and others who've been doing excellent work of having more production in their communities. Maybe it's also a good tool for putting pressure on those that haven't really kept up with their end of the bargain. Is that your impression too?
Yeah, I think so. And you know, we don't get involved in some of the local like land use and individual projects. But you know, we already heard from one of our partners who used the tracker to move their council member on a project, an affordable housing project. So you know, we're going to host a webinar with our partners and really any advocates who are interested in the city, and we hope we'll see some more of that.
Well, that's great. Thanks so much for joining with us. I see there are a couple of folks in the chat box who want to connect with you. I think they want to see if they can create tools like this in their cities and their states as well. So I encourage you to reach back out to them, and then we'll move along to our next speaker, who's Francisca Leblanc from the Utah Housing Coalition. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hi, Sarah, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. So my name is Francisca Leblanc. I am with Utah Housing Coalition. We are based in Salt Lake City, but we are servicing the whole state. Utah Housing Coalition is a membership-based organization, and our members are the experts. And a lot of the work that we do, it is education, outreach, and advocacy, and we focus quite a bit on landlord-tenant related issues. So I was asked to kind of give a short presentation of some of the policy changes that the housing division of the state did to the ERA program. Since its inaction, I think it had 3 or 4 revisions, and one of the biggest revisions that we've been fighting for a very long time is that fees that create housing instability, we're not going to be paying anymore. And what that means is that until May of this year, when if renters had an eviction on their record, whoever was applying on their behalf, the landlord, property manager, or another case manager, they could cover attorney fees. And this is going back to the summer of 2020, when it was suggested by certain eviction attorneys to file evictions if people could not pay rent, to show an urgency, so that we're gonna expedite payment. In August 2020, the state created the Landlord Assistance Program with discretionary CARES Act money. And that program ran until March of last year, when ERA 1 money came into the state. And the only thing we could do at the time was to tell the administrators at the state level that if they are seeing a charge of more $800 for attorney fees, that's a red flag. Because in our state, Most of the evictions are done by one firm, and we usually their fee is $750. That's kind of a magic number that shows up on every single eviction filing. So that was kind of a way for us to tell the state, hey, this is what's been happening. This is what you need to, look for it. And the issue was even covered by an investigative reporter in our state. Kim has the link to the article that was made public last fall in October of 2021, where it was found out that over $180,000 was paid from Era One money to the attorney fees and court fees. And it was an issue that was brought up even to Diane Yantel by the reporter and to Treasury. So based on the guidance from the Treasury, our state was told to not pay those fees anymore. And we're happy to see that it did not say specifically attorney fees and court fees, but it said any fees that create housing instability. So that was a success for us. The unfortunate part is that we might have an idea how much federal money was funneled through those attorney fees using Era 1 and Era 2. We don't know how much of the CARES Act money, the discretionary money that the state set aside for rental assistance. But with that being said, we are grateful for this success, and we are watching the courts to see if there is a spike in evictions, anything that it's unusual. So far we have not seen that change. The other thing, few other changes that were made is that our rents in the state have been increasing exponentially. For us to have monthly rent for $1,800 for one bedroom apartment, it is truly unheard of. And what's been happening is that the state realized that they're paying very large amounts of money, like for base rent. So they had decided to cap it at 150% of the fair market rent, which we feel it's reasonable. The new changes also created some conditions on when the rental assistance can be used for someone who is in a motel. And the reason for that is we do have other sources of money who can cover those kind of situations. So they really want to keep ERA money primarily for traditional rental housing. And it also covers the lot fees for manufactured homeowners. The current pace that they are paying out the payments, the state anticipates that we're going to run out of money by December of this year. And already few local governments like the Salt Lake County is trying to figure out how are we going to move forward in January if we're running completely out of rental assistance, because as we all know, what COVID did, and along with ERA, it really showcased the disparities that exist in housing affordability and equity. So all of those problems that we are seeing now, they were there before, they were just brought to the surface. And we're glad that people and local governments are paying attention to this. My email, it's on the screen. If you want to reach out to me, you are welcome to. I highly, highly recommend to read the article that was posted in the chat. Is addressing numerous issues. And I think some of you might be blown away about what's happening in our state, because they can do it because it says in the law, nothing is stopping them. So I thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, I just have a question. You mentioned
Yes.
that you're looking ahead to what happens at the end of the year when your ERA money runs out.
Right.
What sort of possibilities are there that you're looking at?
So I think right now anything is on the table, because you have our largest county, Salt Lake County, is looking at this in depth, and I think anything is on the table, like finding a dedicated source for some sort of revolving loan fund for rental assistance. I think there is there's an intent over there. It's all about political willingness to do anything about, right? And we were going to continue to reach out to our, congressional delegation. And what is fascinating is that on June 28th, we have the primary elections in Utah, and every single congressperson has an opponent. So for us, this is an opportunity to educate. It will be very interesting to see what happens after June 28th, but this is definitely an opportunity to educate the newcomers, hopefully newcomers, on some of the changes that need to take place, right?
Yeah,
so I don't have
absolutely.
anything concrete. That was a long answer to a short question. I don't have anything concrete. People are thinking about it. We're just trying to figure out.
I know that we've been engaged with reaching out to Romney's office about co-sponsoring the Eviction Crisis Act, which is a bill we've talked about on previous calls that would create a permanent fund for emergency rental assistance going forward. But maybe we can touch base with you in a couple of months and see how that work is going. I really want to thank you for joining on. With that, I'm just going to wrap up and remind folks that we're at the end of our agenda for today, but I don't think it could be any clearer from Congresswoman Waters about what hard work we have ahead of us to make sure that we keep housing resources in a budget reconciliation bill. We know that conversations are happening right now about what makes sense and what doesn't. And really, if there was ever a time, this is the most important time for advocates to be making a lot of noise and to be demanding that resources are included. With that, I want to encourage everybody, like I mentioned earlier, to join our National Call-In Day tomorrow and our Twitter storm, which is at 1 p.m. This is an opportunity for you to call your member of Congress, put that pressure on them to deliver these housing resources. You can use our call-in script, you can use our social media toolkit, but we really need to use these next few weeks to be coordinated and all working in the same direction to make sure housing resources stay in the bill. And with that, I am going to end our call today. I want to thank everybody for joining, and we look forward to continuing to engage with you over the next several weeks. Thanks so much.